Right. Thanks, David. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all today. The environmental perspective. Nice vague title, means I can say what I like. I've already spotted the first deliberate mistake, dangers of cannibalising presentations. It's not the 27th of September, I do know that. Okay, let me first of all touch on some of the issues that Tony was touching on. But the rundown of the issues that we want to bring to the table around shale gas are firstly around local impacts, secondly a couple of greenhouse gas issues about leakage and about the role of gas, some of which we touched on this morning. Thirdly, there's a question about what transformation it will deliver, and the need for policy intervention. I should say, when I say what transformation might shale gas deliver in the EU and the UK, I think it's safe to say we don't know. So why is it up there? It's up there because of the way in which it's already starting to impact on policy and the corrosive impact that it is having, certainly in the UK and potentially in the EU. Let's tackle that one at a time. We've already gone through all of this. Here are some of the speculative impacts that have been suggested. Some speculative, some are a bit more grounded. Impact on groundwater, with or without the associated earthquakes, to impact on the casings, as Tony has touched on. Questions particularly from the US about what kind of chemicals are being used, what's the impact of that, what happens to the produced water, how is that handled, what's the impact on water courses. Another question around water usage in stressed areas. Now, I think it's fair to say that the issue is not whether these can be handled correctly, because it's pretty clear that if you got things right, you can handle all of those correctly. The question is whether they will be, and that's a very different question. That's not in the question about casings and cement. That's more in the questions of regulators and funding and expertise and understanding and capability and political will. And those are a very different kind of set of questions to which the answers are less hard and fast, and to some extent in the eye of the beholder. But I can't help noticing that, for example, the Environment Agency has had a nearly quarter cut in its budgets, along with lots of other regulatory agencies, it has to be said. And my question would not be about whether technically these things are manageable, and much more about whether we have a regulator that is capable of dealing with the regulatory scrutiny and the environmental impact assessments, etc., etc. Because that's where ultimately it's going to have to sit. Those people are going to have to be the responsible people. And I don't have anything against the Environment Agency. I know, people there, and they are good people. But it's quite a big job to take on a whole new area when you're being cut back heavily. So I would not claim to be an expert in a lot of this stuff at all, so I'm not going to bang on about it. But this relates to Tony's kind of socio-economic impact, and how much are people going to be prepared to trust the regulator when people can find out stuff about what's going on in the US quicker than the EA is necessarily, and other regulators actually are capable of doing. Okay, but because they are issues that are pretty well explored already, and because these are the ones I certainly know least about, I'm not going to say any more about that. I'm going to move on to the greenhouse gas questions. And this is the context for the greenhouse gas questions. The data's a little bit old, but it's the same basic picture as you see there. On the right, you see the total carbon budget we have available to the globe in trying to avoid a 2-degree temperature rise. On the left, you'll see the various bars associated with the different kinds of fossil fuels, recoverable reserves expected. This is conventional fossil fuels, not the unconventional, the boost that would appear from the unconventionals, which particularly applies to oil and gas, as we know. And to state the bleeding obvious, the bar on the right is extremely small compared to the entirety of the collective bars on the left. And so, hitting or staying below 2 degrees, generally recognised and indeed internationally recognised as dangerous climate change, a lot of fossil fuel we've already got is going to have to stay in the ground. We haven't yet devised a way of doing that, and what we're doing with the unconventional revolution is adding more to those bars on the left. We're finding more stuff that will have to then stay in the ground. How are we going to do that? That's a very complicated question to which we can have a Q&A afterwards, but this is more about context for what I'm about to say. Let's talk specifically about one of the issues pertaining to shale gas, and that's the greenhouse gas impacts, because as most of you I'm sure know, methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, typically about over a 100-year time period, about 25 times more impactful than CO2. And a lot of questions have been asked about, well, how much then is the leakage around natural gas, or methane rather, from fracking? And if you've been around this debate, you'll know there are huge reports written about fracking and shale gas, but the fact that a report is 1,000 pages long doesn't make it any good if critical elements of the environmental issues haven't actually been looked at, because there's a paucity of data. There is a paucity of data on this. The only actual measurements of, I say at the top there, only actual data to date. This is the only actual data to date that looks at, that independently looks at the entire leakage around an area where extraction is going on, and that's from, as it says there, people from NOAA and University of Colorado estimating on the basis of their measurements in the atmosphere that about 4% of gas is being emitted to the atmosphere. So when you do that and you sort of tread through the maths, the advantage of natural gas from shale gas compared to coal becomes distinctly questionable. Now, one of the things that people raise with me, quite correctly, is that we don't always know what the whole life cycle of conventional gas is either, and the data on that is relatively weak. And then you throw in life cycle analysis of LNG as well, which we also don't have a very good handle on, and the questions multiply rather than get resolved. But I would say that a 4% leakage of gas to the atmosphere does put us in some pretty questionable territory as to whether the overall greenhouse gas impacts of this kind of innovation is actually going to deliver much in the way of environmental benefit. None of that is to say that if you've got gas and you're burning it to produce electricity, you're better off doing that than doing it with coal, because of course, in terms of simple electricity production, gas is far more carbon efficient than coal. But I'll say more about that in a few moments. Okay, moving on then. One of the things that did come out of the IEA's reports, and they've done a couple on gas over the last few years, one just on gas, one specifically on shale gas, this is the former one, questions whether shale gas is actually going to be that transformative, because these are all major contributions, but you'll see that at least as much of the increase in consumption of gas is going to be coming from the conventionals as it is from the unconventionals, and that in turn starts to bring to mind my issues about policy and the impacts on policy, because there are a number of things that we need to bear in mind when we think about what about going ahead with this shale gas revolution. Here's a couple of them, and it should have been obvious from the bars graph that I showed earlier on that just replacing coal with gas still triggers quite substantial climate change. IEA, not surprisingly, looking at those numbers, came pretty much to the same conclusion. And in general, so the second quote there from Meervold and Caldera, Ken Caldera's Stanford University, published this in Environmental Research Letters earlier this year, and looked at replacing coal with gas. That a simple replacement of coal with gas does not provide many substantial benefits in terms of climate benefits in the even in the second half of the century. That's not including even the possible leakage around unconventional gas sources. That's purely looking at conventional gas and looking at the impact of that on climate issues, and it doesn't reveal massive benefits as we go forward, and that the actual benefits come forward through the low carbon, zero carbon technologies. So you'll see that a discussion about unabated gas, as far as I'm concerned, is about trying to contain it as well as about trying to contain coal. And there's no simple global solution to that, because a lot of countries' energy and electricity systems are different, and there isn't a single silver bullet that says what's the right thing to do in these places at these times. An example of that would be excuse me, what's happened in the US. There has been a shift in the power generation sector of coal to gas, and that's been driven by lower gas prices, that's for sure. The EIA data says that shift has been around about 3.5% over 3 years. Curiously, and a lot less reported, is that, again, examination of the EIA data from 2008 to 2011 says that a bigger shift has taken place from coal to renewables. So much written about shale gas transformation in the US, not quite as revolutionary as it first appears, and somewhat, in my humble opinion, over-reported compared to the actuality on the ground. So as I emphasise, those numbers are all from EIA data. There's a blog gone up on our website where you can examine the spreadsheets should you want to. And again, emphasising the role of policy, and has been referred to earlier on, the coal that has been damaged by, whose interest has been damaged in the US, is now being exported to the EU. So it hasn't stopped, certainly not stopped altogether, coal burn, it's just displaced it. And the atmosphere doesn't really care where the coal gets burnt, if it gets burnt. It's not a silver bullet on costs. The IEA's report earlier this year, actually, still saw that if shale were to be exploited major time, it would require a cost that was considerably above the 2010 cost in Europe. So it's not going to bring, at least according to IEA, a major reduction in costs. And I see we've got a friend from Employer here, but also Deutsche Bank saying that the impact on gas prices will be relatively marginal, at least for the foreseeable. Now, UK governments run their own kind of mini consultation roundtable and come to the same conclusion. And Tony, or one of his colleagues, has agreed that it wouldn't be transformative in Britain. So, why do I say all that? It's because, again, anybody reading the press couldn't be under any doubt that there is a battle going on inside UK government. I won't embarrass Chris if he's still here by asking him to comment on that, but there's no question. Oh well, we know this from sort of insider gossip. There is a battle going on about the role of gas in the future electricity system, and those who want a lot of it and those who want a lot less of it. But it is being based on myths about the transformative impact of shale gas, both in terms of quantities, which, as has been repeatedly said, is still unclear, and about its impact on prices. And it always strikes me as slightly ironic that somehow there's a kind of disconnect between the idea of a liberalised European marketing gas and then assuming that because gas is produced in the UK it's going to make it cheap. Well, we can't have both. If we've got a European market for gas, we'll be paying the European gas price. And what sort of impact across Europe are shale gas developments going to have? Well, I think that's still very open to question. I draw on those two studies as examples, saying actually it won't be much. That's quite a different question from saying whether there's an economic benefit to the producer country. But actually, that's the economic benefit from being a producer country is different from saying what should your gas usage policy be, because you've got that European market. Just on the UK shale gas situation, here's a comment from the University of Oklahoma talking about Tony's shale gas exploration, talking about gas in place, saying a large number to extrapolate from a few wells, and there's another quote in the same Reuters article from last year saying, you really need a couple hundred wells before you know where you are. And this report was referred to by Tony. It came out last week. Again, paucity of data, but suggesting that the actual impact will be about a quarter of UK demand by 2030. Now, and again, what's going on in policy around all this? Because most of what we're talking about is gas use in the power sector, which is always going to be marginal or going to be causing additional gas usage on top of the dead weight of gas usage in the UK, which is going to be in heat. There's going to be major uses of gas in heat for a couple of decades at the very least. Any additional gas power station development is almost certainly, irrespective of shale gas development, going to be increasing imports. So it seems to me, again, if you look at the policy discussion, it's kind of disconnected from the fact that we're going to be using a lot of gas, but we're going to be using it for heat. And so this has been a kind of running theme, and I just wanted to pull out the two perspectives which are currently at war inside government. The George Osborne letter to Ed Davey that was leaked to The Guardian. It's worth having a look at. It's still online as far as I can see. Saying unabated gas as a core part of our electricity generation to at least 2030, and implying at least that it should be baseload. Don't know how he squares that with carbon budgets, and in fact the Climate Change Committee saying you can't square it with carbon budgets. So you're going to have to pick one or the other. And there are voices inside government who are indeed plugging that view, and conspicuously after last week's conference, the Liberal Democrats, the one half of the coalition, or part of the coalition I should say, making it clear that's where they're coming from too. And the problem I have with the surrounding narrative to that George Osborne letter is that there are these pervasive myths about the impact that shale gas is going to have. Firstly, when we don't know, because there isn't enough data to know. And secondly, the more reasonable estimates of what the likely impact is going to be doesn't support the position. But it is already being used to drive changes in government policy. Changes in government policy that are going to lock us in to a high carbon infrastructure for decades to come. It's certainly true that, as I said, if you just have, if you ignore the kind of life cycle leakage issues and you simply use gas instead of coal, you will get a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. This is an illustration. I'm grateful to colleagues at WWF for this. The black line shows straight replacement of coal by gas out to 2030. The blue line is the carbon budget recommendation. So you can say there's a pretty sharp divergence from about 2015, and that carbon budgets, legally binding carbon budgets, are not deliverable with a simple coal to gas shift. It needs plenty of other initiatives to make that happen as well. So my conclusions are as I said earlier, it's not whether local issues can be managed, but whether they will in practice. We need quite a lot more data to know whether the leakage issue and the greenhouse gas impact is manageable and is indeed being managed. Until then, we believe that there should be a moratorium on exploitation. We certainly agree that gas is a transitional fuel, but there is already enough fossil fuel out there to take us well into dangerous climate change. And the fact is that Unconventional adds to that budget and makes the overall political management situation worse. And my concluding thought, actually, is that gas does have a role in a decarbonisation drive, but it very much depends on the presence of a climate-friendly energy policy. Because if that policy is operating in a coal-intensive environment, and it manages the leakage and drives out coal and replaces it with gas, whether shale gas or conventional gas, that's a good thing in the short term. If one is in a situation where, like we are in the UK, when there is a drive to a much more low carbon energy policy, then the presence of high amounts of gas cannot help in that decarbonisation drive, except as an adjunct, certainly not as the main player. So it's going to be horses for courses in terms of the role that gas plays, including shale gas, but that you can make no great generalisations. And until a climate-friendly policy is in place much more widely, my concern is that the role of shale gas is only going to be corrosive. Thank you very much.